So in my practice, I use Japanese and Chinese style acupuncture, and I often get asked by my patients, what is the difference? So I want to give you a little bit of background on this, which is going to involve a little bit of history, but it's kind of interesting. So we're going to talk about traditional Chinese medicine, which we use the words TCM, which most people know goes back about 2,000 or 3,000 years. But what a lot of people don't know is that originally Chinese medicine were various different families and lineages who passed their information down through the generations, and they kept it very secret because they didn't have patents. So that's the whole ancient Chinese family secret thing. Then in the 1800s, China saw missionaries coming in, and they brought in Western medicine. So the Chinese started to see these Western ways as a necessary path to modernization. Plus, at the time, there were a lot of epidemics like smallpox and cholera and black fever and many more in those early 1900s. So the government started to turn towards Western medicine, and they even started to view Chinese medicine as backwards. By 1929, in fact, the government wanted to abolish Chinese medicine altogether. But luckily, the Chinese medicine community got together and they protested heavily, and it survived. But their compromise was that Chinese medicine and Western medicine were integrated. But this had a lot of benefits. They researched Chinese herbs for the epidemics. They used acupuncture for anesthesia. So there was a lot of interesting integration that came out of that. In fact, for a brief period in the 1950s, Mao Zedong elevated Chinese medicine as a symbol of China and as a national treasure. However, he did later change his tune when he initiated the Communist Cultural Revolution that lasted from 1966 to 1976. This was a bit of a dark period in Chinese history. Bourgeoisie and intellectuals were condemned, and the Red Guards swept through the country, destroying anything and anyone associated with tradition, including traditional Chinese medicine. So these traditional Chinese doctors, they had to run to the hills or to the mountains to escape. Some people fled to Taiwan, or they'd be captured and imprisoned and killed or sent to indoctrination camps. At the time, Mao said studying is a stupid endeavor for a doctor. So these acupuncture schools were basically shut down in 1970. In 1971, actually, is when Nixon went to China with James Reston, the reporter, and had an emergency appendectomy where he experienced some acupuncture. So at any rate, the Chinese medicine schools were closing down in the 1960s. This opened the door for peasants in China to become basically medics. They were taught a very useful but very bare bones form of Chinese medicine, a handful of acupuncture points, a handful of Chinese herbs compared to thousands. And these newly trained peasants were then sent back to their rural villages where over 90% of the country's population lived. They worked in the capacity of both farmer and caregiver, and these new practitioners were called barefoot doctors. Actually, there were positives about this system. The healthcare costs went way down as preventive healthcare, like hygiene and family planning, were brought into these remote areas. And later, about a fifth of the barefoot doctors ended up going to medical school. So there were some real pluses for the country. But traditional Chinese medicine itself had basically been gutted, as had been Western medicine at the time. So finally, starting in around 1976, once Mao died, the Cultural Revolution was over, and Eastern and Western physicians began to reemerge. The medicine came back, kind of like a rose bush that gets hacked but comes back hardy and strong. Chinese medicine began to flourish again in hospitals and institutions, but it was in a much more codified form than it had ever been before, and those old family lineages had disappeared. So this more codified form of Chinese medicine is what we actually learn in acupuncture schools here today. It has its advantages and its benefits. It's closely tied to the system of herbology, so it works very well for internal medicine, but it doesn't work very well for other systems, other problems like pain, for example. Remember all those ancient family lineages that had been banned from China decades ago? So those styles depend on instant feedback from the body which yields much faster results. So luckily for us, some of those early masters who escaped the mainland broke the code of the family secret and passed their knowledge on to select students for the survival of the medicine. And some of those students eventually came to the United States and taught us here. So I and other acupuncturists, I've spent much of my last 30 years pursuing and studying 3 of these lineages and incorporating them into my practice. One is the late Dr. Etienne Ni, also Master Tong, and Master Tan. Chinese medicine, these also spread to Japan and Korea, and where they did not experience the Cultural Revolution. So masters developed and cultivated their own styles in those countries that were untouched by that communist revolution. So one of the styles that I study comes from Japan. I studied with Kiko Matsumoto, who now lives in Boston, and her system is really exciting and interesting and combines the ancient classics with modern Western science and unblocks blockages from old health and emotional problems that may still be getting in the way of the body's ability to heal. So that technique involves looking for those blockages, clearing them to get instant results. The Japanese style, it generally tends to be use finer needles and can be less painful. You don't stimulate them like you do with the Chinese style, where no pain, no gain. So it's nice to have many options for patients who have different sensitivities. So that's a basic difference between Chinese acupuncture and Japanese acupuncture, with a little bit of history thrown in. Thanks for watching.